My family threw me away like trash, but my little maid chose to die by my side. They didn't know that her touch would awaken the deadliest alpha in history. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The freezing wind howled through the shattered windows of the abandoned Blackwood estate, carrying the bitter promise of a cruel death. Snow drifted across the rotting floorboards like a pale and merciless shroud. Lord Alexander Sterling lay gasping on a mouldering mattress in the darkest corner of the ruined hall. His prestigious family had deliberately left him here to die in the unforgiving winter. They called it a dignified end for a weak and airless disappointment who tainted their pristine bloodline. In the brutal hierarchy of the great shifter houses, a male who failed to present as an alpha by his 20th winter was considered an absolute abomination. Alexander was now 21, violently trembling, and burning with a mysterious flesh-consuming fever that no healer could explain. His own father, the cruel Duke of Stirling, had personally ordered the heavy iron gates locked from the outside just hours ago. The Duke wanted the plunging temperatures to finish off his greatest shame quietly before the new year began. They did not know that someone had intentionally slipped inside the desolate ruins just before the heavy locks turned shut. Grace knelt beside the shivering nobleman with a damp and ragged cloth clutched tightly in her pale, freezing hands. She was only 19, a lowly servant with striking emerald eyes and long chestnut hair that tumbled beautifully over her coarse woolen dress. Her breathtaking beauty was undeniable, but her fierce loyalty was what truly set her apart from the rest of the cowardly household. While the rest of the well-paid servants eagerly fled back to the warm capital, Grace had risked everything to stay by his side. Alexander had shown her rare kindness once by saving her from a brutal whipping when she first arrived frightened at the grand estate. She had silently sworn her fragile life to him in that exact moment, promising to never abandon him when the world turned dark. Now, she gently wiped the glistening sweat from his burning forehead, completely ignoring the bitter cold that viciously gnawed at her own bones. "You must hold on, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with fierce determination that defied the freezing room. Alexander let out a guttural groan as his broad spine arched in a sudden, violent spasm that seemed to shatter the quiet air. The intense fever consuming his body was not acting like any normal winter sickness she had ever witnessed in the servants' quarters. His thick veins pulsed beneath his pale skin with a strange, dark, and terrifying heat that felt like boiling magma. Grace watched in absolute horror as his skin seemed to glow with a molten golden hue beneath the delicate surface. He suddenly gripped her delicate wrist with a crushing, possessive strength he had never possessed before in his entire life. His dull human fingernails were rapidly lengthening and darkening into something incredibly sharp, predatory, and deadly. The royal medical books always stated that a late-stage presentation would completely tear a human body apart from the inside out. The sheer agony of his heavy bones violently reshaping caused a primal, terrifying roar to rip straight from his bleeding throat. Grace gasped and fell back onto the freezing floor as the sheer volume of the animalistic sound shook the heavy dust from the wooden rafters. This was certainly not the pitiful, whimpering death rattle of a broken omega taking his final, tragic breath. This was the terrifying and earth-shattering dominance of a rapidly awakening alpha claiming his absolute power. The scent in the icy room instantly shifted from the sour stench of sickness to the overwhelming aroma of raw pine, dark musk, and lethal danger. It was a pheromone so thick and impossibly powerful that it forced Grace to her hands and knees in pure, instinctual submission to a higher predator. She could barely breathe, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs as she stared wide-eyed at the man she thought she knew so well. Alexander's chest expanded violently as his muscles tore and rebuilt themselves under his searing skin in a matter of agonizing seconds. He was no longer the fragile, sickly boy the arrogant Duke had so easily tossed away like yesterday's garbage. His golden eyes snapped open, blazing with an ancient and untamed fury that effortlessly pierced the freezing winter darkness. He slowly sat up, towering over Grace's small frame, radiating a massive heat that instantly melted the winter snow gathering around them. Grace trembled violently, unsure if she had just miraculously saved the gentle man she loved or accidentally unleashed a ruthless monster. Alexander stared down at the beautiful, terrified girl who had selflessly chosen to face a certain death just to be beside him. His massive, burning hand reached out to tenderly brush a stray chestnut curl away from her tear-stained, freezing cheek. "You stayed when the whole world walked away," his voice rumbled, deeper and infinitely more dangerous than any sound she had ever heard. The feral, hungry intensity in his glowing golden gaze made her breath catch painfully in her delicate throat. He inhaled deeply, eagerly committing the sweet, terrified scent of her vanilla and wild chamomile to his newly awakened, highly sensitive senses. In the brutal and ancient world of shifter politics, an alpha's very first imprint was a sacred bond stronger than blood, magic, or time itself. His cold-blooded family had callously thrown him into the abyss to die a forgotten weakling without a second thought. Instead, they had forcefully awakened a dormant, ancient royal bloodline that had not been seen on this divided continent in over 1,000 years. Alexander pulled Grace firmly against his massive, burning chest, wrapping her securely in his overwhelming protective warmth. The absolute, undeniable possessiveness in his iron grip told her everything she desperately needed to know about her dangerous new reality. He was no longer just the gentle young lord she obediently served in the shadows of the Grand Manor. He was a prime alpha, and she was the absolute only treasure he fully intended to keep in this wretched, unforgiving world. "They will pay heavily for this, Grace," he growled, the low, monstrous sound vibrating deeply through her entire trembling body. "Every single one of them who left us to die in this frozen hell will fall weeping and broken to their knees." Grace squeezed her eyes shut, clinging desperately to his incredibly broad shoulders as the howling wind outside seemed to answer his dark, violent promise. The foolish Duke truly thought he had successfully buried his greatest shame tonight beneath the heavy winter snow. He had absolutely no idea he had just forcefully birthed his own terrifying and inescapable destruction. Tomorrow, the distant, arrogant capital would surely burn under the unstoppable wrath of the legendary Blackwood Wolf. But tonight, the newly crowned king of the Alphas only cared about keeping his devoted, beautiful maid safe and warm. Grace closed her eyes, letting the heavy tears of utter relief and overwhelming emotion finally fall down her pale, soft cheeks. She had mentally prepared herself to dig his lonely grave in the frozen mud by tomorrow's bleak sunrise. Instead, she was being fiercely cradled in the protective, unyielding arms of a literal god who had just conquered death itself. The bitter frostbite that had started to painfully numb her delicate fingers was completely gone in his overwhelming embrace. Alexander's immense body heat was like a roaring fireplace, completely shielding her from the lethal winter drafts pouring through the shattered windows. He shifted his weight slightly, pulling the ragged, filthy blankets off the moldy mattress and tossing them aside with pure aristocratic disdain. They certainly wouldn't be needing the rotting cloth ever again now that his internal fire had been fully ignited. He gathered her easily into his powerful lap, treating her with a profound and terrifying gentleness that beautifully contradicted his monstrous strength. "Rest now, my brave girl," he murmured, his large, burning thumb tracing her soft jawline with an undeniable sense of absolute ownership. "When the morning sun rises, we leave this frozen graveyard behind forever to claim what is rightfully ours." Grace buried her face deep into the crook of his warm, muscular neck, finally allowing pure exhaustion and safety to take her under. She did not fear the lethal, world-ending power hiding in the hard muscles beneath her resting cheek. She only felt an overwhelming sense of true, eternal belonging that she had never known as an abandoned orphan maid. The Duke of Stirling had selfishly sought to erase a useless, broken son from his proud family tree tonight. He had unknowingly written the bloody, unstoppable prologue to the most violent and passionate legend the shifter world would ever know. The howling winter storm finally broke as the first pale light of dawn crept through the shattered stones of the forsaken northern keep. Alexander stood near the ruined archway, his massive shoulders blocking the freezing morning wind from reaching the sleeping girl behind him. The debilitating fever had vanished entirely, replaced by an endless reservoir of raw, thrumming power that coiled deep within his newly forged muscles. He was no longer the sickly outcast of the Sterling bloodline, he was a primordial force of nature clad in human skin. Grace stirred softly on the dry stones, opening her vibrant emerald eyes to the surreal sight of her protector bathed in the beautiful morning light. She had fully expected to wake up freezing and utterly alone, but instead, she found herself draped in his overwhelming warmth and absolute safety. The sound of heavy, crunching boots against the fresh snow outside abruptly shattered the peaceful silence of their isolated sanctuary. Alexander's golden eyes instantly flashed in the dim light, tracking the unmistakable scent of the 3 cruel knights approaching their ruined door. These were his father's most ruthless executioners, sent from the distant capital to confirm that the pathetic heir had finally perished in the cold. "Stay exactly where you are, my sweet Grace," Alexander murmured, his deep voice carrying a command that her very soul instinctively obeyed. He stepped out into the blinding white courtyard just as the heavily armored knights kicked open the rotting wooden gates with arrogant force. The lead knight, a massive brute named Cale, stopped dead in his tracks and burst into cruel, mocking laughter at the sight of the bare-chested lord. "Look at this miserable wretch, still clinging to life like a starved stray dog," Cale sneered, drawing a heavy steel broadsword from his scabbard. "The Duke ordered us to bring back your worthless head if the frostbite didn't do the job properly last night," the second knight taunted, stepping forward. Grace pressed her trembling hands against her mouth, peering through the broken window frame with her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She remembered Cale vividly. He was the very monster who had ordered her whipped in the courtyard all those terrifying months ago. Alexander did not shrink back, nor did he beg for the mercy that had always been repeatedly denied to him by his treacherous family. Instead, a terrifying, guttural growl vibrated from deep within his broad chest, a sound so unnatural it made the knight's warhorses scream in sudden terror. The stifling, dominant pheromones of a supreme alpha exploded into the crisp morning air, hitting the arrogant knights like a physical battering ram. Cale's mocking smile instantly vanished as the crushing weight of Alexander's aura forced the seasoned warrior to stumble backward in pure, instinctual panic. Before the brute could even swing his heavy blade, Alexander vanished from his spot and materialized directly in front of the heavily armored man. It was an impossible display of blinding speed that defied all human logic and completely shattered the knight's false sense of superiority. With a single, effortless motion, Alexander grabbed the knight's thick steel breastplate and hoisted the 200-pound man into the air like a ragdoll. "You dared to lay your filthy hands on what is mine," Alexander whispered, his golden eyes blazing with a lethal, unforgiving wrath as he looked at Cale. The sickening sound of metal crumpling and bone snapping echoed loudly across the frozen courtyard as Alexander simply crushed the knight's chest with one bare hand. Cale dropped to the blood-stained snow without a single cry, instantly dead before his heavy sword even clattered against the icy ground. The remaining 2 executioners froze in absolute horror, their arrogant faces draining of all color as they stared at the monster their duke had created. This was not a late-stage presentation failure, this was the legendary awakening of a mythic alpha line that the history books claimed was long extinct. They turned to flee in cowardly desperation, but the newborn alpha was already upon them, a beautiful and terrifying tempest of unrestrained vengeance. In less than 10 seconds, the courtyard was dead silent again, littered with the broken remains of the men who had come to collect a pathetic corpse. Grace watched the horrific carnage from the shadows, her breath caught in her throat as she processed the sheer, devastating brutality of her new lord. Yet, as she stared at the fresh blood dripping from his powerful knuckles, she felt absolutely zero fear toward the man who had just committed murder. Every violent strike he landed had been fueled by a profound desire to protect her and to avenge the countless injustices they had both quietly suffered. Alexander turned back toward the ruins, his lethal golden eyes instantly softening the moment they locked onto Grace's beautiful, wide-eyed gaze. He walked back inside, completely unbothered by the cold, and stripped a heavy, fur-lined winter cloak from one of the fallen knight's saddles. With incredibly gentle hands that had just shattered steel, he wrapped the thick, luxurious fur tightly around Grace's trembling, fragile shoulders. He knelt before her, carefully tying the leather straps beneath her chin, completely ignoring the aristocratic pride that forbade a lord from serving a lowly maid. "The path ahead of us will be paved with the blood of my kin, Grace," he said softly, his voice a deep, comforting rumble that vibrated through her core. "If you wish to run, I will give you a fortune in gold and ensure you disappear safely into the free cities before the sun sets." Grace reached out from beneath the heavy fur cloak and pressed her small, warm palm firmly against his blood-stained, wildly beating chest. "I swore my life to you when you were weak, Alexander," she whispered fiercely, using his first name for the very first time in her entire life. "I will not abandon you now that you are strong enough to finally take the world that owes you absolutely everything." A breathtaking, genuinely happy smile broke across Alexander's handsome face, illuminating the dark ruins far better than the rising winter sun ever could. He swept her up into his powerful arms effortlessly, holding her tightly against his chest as if she were the most precious jewel in the entire kingdom. Together, they walked out of the forsaken ruins, stepping right over the broken bodies of their arrogant enemies without a single backward glance. The Duke of Stirling had sent his men to confirm a quiet tragedy, but instead, he had just summoned the Grim Reaper directly to his own luxurious doorstep. The winter wind howled once more, but this time, it felt like a triumphant horn signaling the glorious, unstoppable return of the true sovereign. Their journey to the distant, corrupt capital had officially begun, and hell itself was riding closely alongside the newly awakened winter wolf. And safely tucked within the fierce protection of the beast, a lowly orphan maid was about to become the most feared and revered woman in the realm. The massive iron-shod hooves of the stolen warhorse clattered loudly against the cobblestones of Raven's Peak. The border town was a chaotic hive of merchants, mercenaries, and corrupt officials, all seeking warmth within its high stone walls. Alexander sat tall in the saddle, his powerful arms wrapped like iron bands around Grace's waist, shielding her from the biting mountain wind. Though they were dressed in travel-worn cloaks, Alexander's sheer presence commanded the narrow, crowded streets to part before them. The predatory aura radiating from his body was like a silent, invisible blade cutting through the thick morning fog. He steered the great stallion toward the most expensive establishment in the district, a grand boutique known as the Gilded Lily. Grace looked up at the polished oak doors and the shimmering glass windows with wide, uncertain eyes. "Alexander, I am just a maid. I do not belong in a place of such luxury," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the city noise. Alexander tightened his grip on her, his chin resting briefly against the top of her chestnut head with an unyielding possessiveness. "You were a maid in a world that didn't deserve you, Grace," he rumbled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, protective heat. "In my world, you are the only thing that matters, and you will be treated like the queen you are." He dismounted with a fluid, lethal grace, and easily lifted her down from the horse, refusing to let her feet touch the slushy, gray snow. As they stepped into the heated interior of the boutique, the sweet scent of expensive perfumes and fine silks filled their senses. A middle-aged woman dressed in extravagant lavender lace turned toward them, her face instantly twisting into a sneer of pure disgust. "We do not serve beggars or stable hands here," she said, her voice dripping with the practiced arrogance of the town's elite. Beside her stood the sheriff's wife, a woman known for her cruelty, who began to laugh behind a delicate lace fan. "Look at that ragged creature she brought in. I can smell the stench of the servants' quarters from here," the sheriff's wife mocked. Grace's face flushed a deep, painful red, and she instinctively tried to hide behind Alexander's broad, muscular frame. But Alexander didn't move an inch back. Instead, he allowed the terrifying weight of his alpha power to fill the entire room. The air in the boutique suddenly became heavy and suffocating, as if the very oxygen had been replaced by pure, concentrated dread. The laughter died instantly as the two women felt their knees buckle under the crushing pressure of a pheromone they had never encountered. Alexander's golden eyes glowed with a terrifying, ancient light as he stared directly at the woman who had dared to insult his companion. "You will apologize to her," he said, his voice low and calm, yet sounding like the precursor to a violent, world-ending storm. "And then you will bring out every piece of silk, fur, and jewelry you own that is worthy of her beauty." The shopkeeper fell to her hands and knees, her body trembling so violently that her teeth began to chatter in the stifling heat. The sheriff's wife was already sobbing on the floor, her arrogant facade completely shattered by the primal dominance of the winter wolf. I am so sorry, my lady," the shopkeeper gasped, her forehead pressed against the polished floorboards in total submission. Alexander didn't even acknowledge the apology, he simply tossed a heavy leather pouch filled with sterling gold onto the counter. The sound of the coins clinking together was like a death knell for the shopkeeper's pride. "Dress her," Alexander commanded, his hand gently lingering on Grace's shoulder to reassure her that she was safe. For the next hour, Grace was treated with a frantic, terrified reverence that she had only ever seen directed toward the Duke's daughters. She was bathed in warm, scented water and dressed in a gown of deep emerald velvet that matched the vibrant color of her eyes. The shopkeeper's trembling fingers fastened a heavy cloak of white fox fur around her shoulders, making her look like a winter goddess. When Grace finally stepped out from the dressing room, even Alexander felt his breath hitch in his powerful chest. Her chestnut hair had been brushed until it shone like polished bronze, framing a face that was as fierce as it was beautiful. She looked at herself in the tall silver mirror, hardly recognizing the girl who had spent her life scrubbing floors in the dark. Alexander walked over to her, his heavy boots silent on the plush carpet, and draped a heavy gold necklace around her delicate throat. "Never look down again, Grace," he whispered into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "From this moment on, the world will be the one bowing to you." They left the shop with the terrified staff still huddled on the floor, too afraid to even look up until the bells on the door stopped ringing. Next, Alexander led her to the most prestigious tavern in Raven's Peak, a place where the local lords gathered to drink and boast. As they entered, the rowdy conversation died out as every man in the room felt the sudden, overwhelming arrival of a supreme predator. Alexander took the largest table by the hearth, pulling out a chair for Grace with the refined manners of a prince and the aura of a king. A group of drunken mercenaries at a nearby table tried to catcall at Grace, but their voices failed them before a single word could escape. Alexander simply looked at them, and the sheer, cold promise of death in his gaze forced them to look down at their drinks in silence. The tavern keeper hurried over, bowing so low his nose nearly touched the table, offering his finest wines and roasted meats. "We are just passing through," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent, crowded room. "But let it be known to every soul in this town that this woman is under my absolute protection. Whoever looks at her with disrespect, whoever speaks a foul word in her presence, will answer to me personally." He leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of Grace's chair, his presence claiming the entire building as his own. Grace sat beside him, sipping the rich, red wine, feeling the warmth of the fire and the even greater warmth of the man beside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the shadows or the powerful men who ruled the world. She realized that the boy she had saved in the ruins had become a shield that no army could ever hope to break. And as Alexander watched her with those glowing golden eyes, she saw more than just protection, she saw a hunger that was entirely for her. The revenge against the Sterling family was coming, and it would be a bloody, scorched earth affair that would change history. But in this moment, in this small town at the edge of the world, Alexander was simply a man making sure his woman was cherished. The winter wolf had found his mate, and the world was about to find out exactly how far he would go to keep her smiling. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but inside the tavern, the air was thick with the scent of pine, musk, and a new, unbreakable hope. The dark news of what transpired in the border town of Ravens Peak traveled swiftly across the frozen plains to the grand capital. Duke Sterling sat upon his plush velvet throne, his aging face twisting into a mask of absolute fury as the terrified messenger relayed the impossible tale. He completely refused to believe that his discarded, worthless son had magically awakened as a mythical supreme alpha. In his deeply arrogant mind, Alexander was merely using some dark, forbidden trickery to create a pathetic illusion of real power. To crush this embarrassing and sudden rebellion, the Duke immediately dispatched his favored son and chosen heir, Lord Julian. Julian was a fully recognized alpha, a cruel and breathtakingly vain man who wore his power like a heavy, suffocating collar over the weaker nobles. Accompanied by 50 heavily armored elite guards, Julian rode out eagerly to exterminate the brother he had viciously tormented since childhood. Meanwhile, Alexander and Grace were quietly leaving the safety of the mountain town, their stolen black stallion moving gracefully through the snow-covered pine forest. Grace leaned her back comfortably against Alexander's incredibly solid chest, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace that completely defied their dangerous reality. She wore the stunning emerald velvet gown and the heavy white fox fur, looking every bit the high-born lady she was never meant to be. Alexander kept one large, aggressively protective hand resting firmly on her thigh, his heightened senses constantly scanning the dense tree line for any hidden threat. He easily caught the foul, metallic scent of his brother's approaching forces long before the thunderous sound of their galloping horses echoed through the silent woods. Alexander gently pulled back the thick leather reins, bringing their massive warhorse to a calm, deliberate halt in the center of a wide, snowy clearing. "Do not be afraid of what is about to happen, my sweet Grace," he murmured, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm, indestructible shield. "I am never afraid when I am safely in your arms," she replied softly, her brilliant emerald eyes filled with absolute, unwavering trust. Within mere moments, the distant tree line aggressively erupted with heavily armored riders, their drawn steel swords gleaming wickedly in the pale winter sunlight. Lord Julian rode arrogantly at the very front of the hunting pack, his handsome face marred by a cruel, mocking sneer as he finally looked upon his outcast brother. "I see you found a dead rich man's coat and decided to dress up your filthy little servant whore, Alexander," Julian spat, his voice dripping with venomous disdain. At the sound of that incredibly vile insult directed at Grace, a low, terrifying growl rumbled from the very depths of Alexander's massive chest. The sound was so primal and unnaturally dark that Julian's expensive warhorse whinnied in sudden, uncontrollable panic and desperately tried to buck its rider into the snow. Julian frantically struggled to control his frightened mount, his aristocratic face flushing bright red with deep embarrassment and mounting, fiery rage. "You actually think a cheap tavern trick makes you a real alpha?" Julian shouted, foolishly unleashing his own pheromones in a desperate attempt to dominate the snowy clearing. A heavy, suffocating scent of burnt ash and sour iron filled the cold air, a scent that would normally force any lesser being directly to their knees in weeping submission. Alexander did not even blink at the pathetic, incredibly weak display of power from the spoiled brother who had once beaten him for sport. Instead, Alexander smoothly dismounted the massive stallion, gently but firmly instructing Grace to remain in the saddle where she was perfectly safe above the ground. He took slow, highly deliberate steps toward Julian, his golden eyes glowing with a lethal, demonic intensity that seemed to literally burn through the freezing winter air. Then, Alexander finally released the full, devastating weight of his true supreme alpha aura without holding a single ounce of his power back. The impact was not just a mere scent, it was a physical, bone-crushing force that violently slammed into the 50 elite guards like an invisible, catastrophic avalanche. Grown men gasped for breath as they were forcefully thrown from their saddles, their bodies instinctively curling into whimpering submission on the frozen, unforgiving ground. Julian's arrogant sneer instantly vanished from his face, replaced entirely by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror as the immense pressure physically cracked his ribs. He fell heavily from his panicked horse, his expensive silver armor digging deeply into the snow as he frantically clawed at his own throat, completely unable to draw a single breath. Alexander stood tall and imposing over his gasping brother, looking down at the Duke's highly favored heir with nothing but cold, absolute aristocratic disgust. "You were always a weak, sniveling coward merely masquerading as a wolf, Julian," Alexander stated, his deep voice booming like thunder across the perfectly silent clearing. Desperate and terrified of dying in the mud, Julian pulled a hidden silver dagger from his boot and threw it blindly, not at Alexander, but directly toward the beautiful woman on the horse. He foolishly hoped the sudden, violent distraction would give him a brief chance to escape the unstoppable monster standing over him. Alexander's glowing golden eyes widened in pure feral rage, his massive muscles instantly tensing to unleash a horrific bloodbath that would leave no man alive in the forest. But as the silver blade flew rapidly through the air, Grace did not scream, flinch, or cower in fear as a normal, terrified servant would have done. She remained perfectly still atop the horse, her unwavering, absolute faith in her protector blinding her to the danger. Alexander effortlessly caught the flying silver blade mid-air with his bare hand, the sharp metal completely unable to even pierce his hardened, supernatural skin. In that terrifying fraction of a second, as Alexander's mind rapidly teetered on the very edge of mindless, instinctual slaughter, a new scent suddenly bloomed in the cold air. It was the incredibly delicate, unbelievably sweet aroma of wild vanilla and blooming summer jasmine, radiating entirely and powerfully from Grace. The sudden, deeply intoxicating scent washed instantly over Alexander's enraged senses, miraculously cooling the violent, bloody inferno burning within his mind. He looked back at Grace, realizing with profound, world-altering shock that the supposedly ordinary little maid was actually harboring the dormant scent of a highly coveted, true Omega. Her immense loyalty and profound, unconditional trust in him had unknowingly triggered her own latent awakening, permanently binding her soul to his in the most ancient and sacred way. Alexander's feral, bloodthirsty roar completely died in his throat, replaced instead by a deep, rumbling purr of absolute satisfaction and endless, consuming devotion. He turned his attention back to the pathetic, whimpering mess of a brother lying helplessly in the bloody snow. Alexander reached down without hesitation and effortlessly snapped Julian's sword arm like a dry twig, completely ignoring the agonizing scream that echoed through the quiet trees. "I am leaving you alive for one reason only, Julian," Alexander whispered, his dark voice sending violent shivers down the spine of every single man present. "You will crawl back to our treacherous father and tell him that the Winter Wolf has successfully claimed his true mate, and he is coming to claim his throne." Alexander deliberately turned his broad back on the defeated heir, his heavy boots crunching loudly as he walked back to his stunning, newly awakened Omega Queen. He looked up at Grace, his glowing eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful worship that no other woman in history had ever been lucky enough to receive. He gently lifted her delicate, warm hand to his lips, pressing a deeply reverent, lingering kiss against her soft knuckles. The world was absolutely going to burn to the ground very soon, but those violent flames would only serve to keep his magnificent, beautiful queen perfectly warm. The freezing wind whipped violently through the towering pine trees as Alexander carried his precious cargo deeper into the uncharted, treacherous mountain territory. Grace was shivering uncontrollably against his broad, muscular chest, completely consumed by the sudden, overwhelming fever of her first Omega presentation. The unbelievably sweet, intoxicating scent of wild vanilla and blooming jasmine was pouring from her delicate skin, driving his protective instincts into an absolute frenzy. He knew they could not simply stay out in the open wilderness while her fragile human body underwent such a profound, painful, and ancient transformation. Guided strictly by the dormant, ancient memories of his awakened winter wolf bloodline, he steered his massive warhorse toward a hidden, forgotten sanctuary carved directly into the high mountainside. This was the legendary Sunstone Lodge, a mythical, sprawling retreat built by the very first Shifter kings, entirely unknown to the corrupt, arrogant nobility of the modern capital. Alexander carefully carried Grace through the heavy, rune-carved stone doors, instantly escaping the biting winter cold and stepping into a beautifully preserved, cavernous hall. He gently laid her violently trembling body upon a massive, circular bed that was heavily draped in thick, ancient velvet and pristine, snow-white animal pelts. Grace whimpered softly in the quiet room, her brilliant emerald eyes completely glazed over with a dizzying, terrifying heat as the powerful omega biology violently reshaped her fragile senses. "I am burning alive, Alexander," she sobbed weakly, blindly reaching out with her delicate, freezing hands to desperately find the reassuring warmth of his massive frame. Alexander immediately stripped away his heavy, snow-covered winter cloak, tossing it carelessly aside before climbing onto the vast bed to gather her tightly into his strong arms. He instinctively began the sacred, ancient process of building a proper protective nest, carefully arranging the softest furs and his own scent-drenched clothing entirely around her trembling form. The legendary Supreme Alpha, a terrifying man who had just shattered a seasoned knight's spine with a single hand, was now diligently performing the gentle, loving duties of a devoted caretaker. He continuously murmured deep, rumbling words of endless comfort, his dark, rich pheromones of cedar pine and musk acting as a highly powerful, soothing balm for her searing pain. Every single time she cried out from the overwhelming intensity of the biological shift, he pressed soft, incredibly reverent kisses directly to her burning forehead and tear-stained cheeks. He vowed silently to the forgotten old gods that he would gladly burn the entire world to ash if it meant sparing this incredible, selfless woman another single moment of suffering. While the winter wolf tenderly and patiently nursed his beautiful mate in the quiet mountains, absolute, unadulterated chaos had finally erupted within the luxurious stone walls of the capital. Lord Julian had just violently crashed through the heavily polished mahogany doors of the grand throne room, his shattered arm hanging uselessly at his side, his face pale with unimaginable terror. Duke Sterling stood up rapidly from his velvet seat in utter shock, completely unable to comprehend the bloody, thoroughly defeated state of his most prized, undefeated son. "Father, the outcast is not a mere trickster using cheap tavern magic," Julian wept openly before the entire assembled court, completely abandoning his usual arrogant pride in the face of pure, lingering trauma. "He completely crushed my elite guards with a single burst of his terrifying aura, without even drawing a blade from his leather belt." The crowded, opulent throne room instantly fell into a terrified, suffocating silence as the horrifying reality of Julian's pathetic words slowly washed over the arrogant, pampered nobility. "He is a true Supreme Alpha, Father," Julian choked out, coughing up dark blood onto the pristine marble floor as the surrounding nobles began to loudly murmur in absolute, rising panic. "And he has found his fated Omega mate, an incredibly powerful woman whose very scent completely paralyzed my men with absolute awe." Duke Sterling collapsed heavily back into his golden chair, the healthy color rapidly draining from his wrinkled face as the sheer magnitude of his monumental, irreversible mistake hit him. By trying to quietly and cleanly execute his weakest, most disappointing son in the freezing wilderness, he had accidentally resurrected a mythical, unstoppable bloodline that demanded total, unquestioning submission. The ancient, unbreakable laws of their kind were absolutely clear. A Supreme Alpha who had successfully claimed an Omega mate was considered a divine ruler appointed directly by the gods themselves. Every single nobleman who had previously mocked the sickly boy suddenly realized that their magnificent, wealthy city was completely defenseless against his coming, justified wrath. Back in the deeply peaceful sanctuary of the Sunstone Lodge, the raging, agonizing fever had finally broken, leaving Grace bathed in a soft, ethereal, and perfectly healthy glow. She slowly opened her vibrant emerald eyes, the painful, confusing haze completely gone, replaced entirely by an astonishing, crystal-clear perception of the vibrant world around her. She could feel the steady, incredibly powerful rhythm of Alexander's massive heartbeat directly beneath her cheek, sensing his deep emotions as clearly as if they were exactly her own. The sacred, unbreakable mating bond had successfully formed during the long, difficult night, permanently tethering their two desperate souls together across time, space, and tragedy. Alexander looked deeply down at her, his glowing golden eyes filled with an overwhelming, breathless adoration that made her newly awakened heart flutter wildly in her chest. "You survived the fire, my beautiful, perfect queen," he whispered gently, carefully brushing a damp lock of chestnut hair away from her radiant, beautifully flushed face. Grace smiled back at him, a breathtaking, radiant expression of pure love and absolute, unwavering confidence that instantly erased the last remaining shadows of the timid little maid she used to be. She reached up without hesitation and boldly traced the hard, masculine line of his jaw, completely unafraid of the lethal, world-ending power vibrating just beneath his golden skin. "I survived it only because you held me so closely, Alexander," she replied, her newly awakened Omega voice carrying a melodic, incredibly soothing resonance that instantly captivated his entire being. She felt a profound, undeniable surge of raw strength flowing directly from his unbreakable bond, perfectly filling the empty, lonely spaces of her previously broken, orphaned soul. Alexander leaned down slowly and captured her soft lips in a deeply passionate, soul-searing kiss that completely solidified their eternal union before the silent, watching gods. The gentle, unbelievably sweet taste of her mouth was the greatest, most profound treasure he had ever known, infinitely more valuable than any golden crown or sprawling kingdom the world could ever offer. When he finally pulled back to catch his breath, he looked deeply into her beautiful emerald eyes, completely laying his darkened soul bare for only her to see. "We will rest safely here until you are fully recovered and perfectly comfortable with your magnificent, beautiful new strength," he promised gently, holding her delicate hands tightly against his chest. "And then, we will ride directly down from this mountain and completely tear my father's corrupt, vile empire apart, piece by bloody, unforgiving piece." Grace did not tremble, hesitate, or cry at the terrifying thought of the coming, inevitable war. Instead, she leaned deeply into his loving embrace, her heart fiercely aligning with his righteous, unstoppable vengeance. The terrified, weeping capital was currently begging and praying loudly for a mercy that the winter wolf absolutely, unequivocally did not possess in his hardened heart. Alexander had finally found the single, brilliant, saving light in his dark, unforgiving life, and he would happily paint the entire world bright red to ensure she never suffered another bad day again. The fierce winter storms finally surrendered to a blinding, crystal-clear sunrise as Alexander and Grace descended from the ancient mountain sanctuary. They rode together atop the massive black stallion, officially leaving the peaceful safety of the Sunstone Lodge to face the corrupt world that had once tried to destroy them. Grace sat incredibly tall and entirely unafraid before him, her delicate hands resting confidently over the hard, muscular arms wrapped protectively around her waist. She was no longer wearing the heavy, borrowed furs of a hidden fugitive, but an elegant, deep crimson riding cloak that perfectly complemented her breathtaking emerald eyes. The profound, sacred mating bond thrummed powerfully within her newly awakened Omega soul, connecting her every heartbeat directly to the unstoppable supreme alpha behind her. Alexander's glowing golden eyes were locked fiercely on the distant horizon, where the towering white stone spires of the grand capital city pierced the freezing winter sky. For 21 agonizing years, that magnificent city had been a brutal, unforgiving cage where he was relentlessly mocked, beaten, and starved for his supposed genetic weakness. Today, he was returning not as a broken outcast begging for his father's meager scraps, but as an ancient, vengeful god of war coming to reclaim his stolen kingdom. Word of his terrifying, unstoppable awakening had completely paralyzed the capital with an overwhelming, suffocating dread over the past 3 chaotic days. Duke Sterling, driven completely mad by his own inescapable terror and looming demise, had aggressively marshaled every single soldier, knight, and mercenary he could possibly afford. Over 10,000 heavily armored men stood in tense, shivering formations outside the towering iron city gates, their polished steel weapons trembling visibly in their terrified hands. They had been explicitly ordered by the panicked Duke to slaughter the winter wolf the absolute second he appeared on the snowy plains, regardless of the heavy casualties. However, the frightened soldiers were completely unprepared for the breathtaking, deeply surreal sight that eventually emerged from the distant, fog-covered pine tree line. Alexander did not bring a massive, roaring army of vicious rebels to lay a bloody, protracted siege to his father's heavily fortified stronghold. He rode completely alone across the vast expanse of white snow, holding absolutely nothing but the thick leather reins of his horse and the beautiful, radiant woman he had chosen as his queen. The sheer, absolute arrogance of a single, unarmed man casually challenging an entire fortified army caused a ripple of confusing, terrified whispers to wash rapidly through the defensive ranks. Duke Sterling stood high above the battlefield on the cold stone battlements, his aging, wrinkled hands tightly gripping the frozen parapet as he stared wide-eyed at his rapidly approaching doom. "Draw your bows and loose the arrows right now," the desperate Duke screamed at his elite archers, his voice cracking wildly under the immense weight of his total, pathetic panic. "Kill him before he reaches the main gates, or I will personally hang every single one of you useless cowards from the highest towers." Thousands of heavy wooden bows were drawn back in total unison, the deadly steel-tipped arrows aiming directly at the lone rider moving steadily across the snowy, silent battlefield. But before a single deadly arrow could be released into the crisp winter air, Alexander deliberately unleashed the absolute, terrifying zenith of his supreme alpha presence. It was not merely a heavy scent or a vague, fleeting feeling of dread, but a colossal, physical shockwave of pure, dominant power that violently slammed into the fortified walls. The ancient, slumbering wolf spirits deep within every single soldier instantly recognized the undeniable, absolute authority of their true, long-lost sovereign ruler. Thousands of grown men abruptly collapsed to their knees in the cold mud, dropping their expensive weapons as their deep biological instincts violently overrode their lifelong military training. The heavy, terrifying aura of the winter wolf pressed them firmly and mercilessly into the ground, demanding their absolute, unquestioning submission to his divine, royal bloodline. Yet, woven beautifully and seamlessly within that terrifying, suffocating pressure was the incredibly sweet, intoxicating scent of wild vanilla and blooming summer jasmine. Grace's powerful, perfectly harmonized omega pheromones washed softly over the terrified army, promising gentle mercy to those who chose to bow, and absolute, agonizing death to those who resisted. The breathtaking combination of the Supreme Alpha's destructive wrath and his fated mate's soothing grace was a legendary phenomenon that no living shifter had ever witnessed in history. It was an ancient, undeniable magic that completely shattered the Duke's desperate, incredibly expensive defenses without a single drop of human blood being spilled on the pristine snow. Alexander steered his massive stallion slowly and deliberately through the newly parted sea of kneeling, weeping soldiers, his golden eyes completely ignoring their pathetic, whimpering forms. He did not even bother to draw his sword as he finally reached the towering, heavily reinforced iron gates that had been cruelly locked against him his entire miserable life. With a single, devastatingly powerful kick from his heavy leather boot, Alexander completely shattered the massive, forged iron hinges, sending the giant doors crashing violently onto the cobblestone streets. The deafening, explosive sound of the falling metal gates echoed loudly throughout the entire trembling city, officially announcing the brutal, unstoppable end of the corrupt Sterling regime. Grace looked up at the towering stone battlements, her brilliant green eyes locking directly onto the pale, absolutely horrified face of the arrogant Duke who had once ordered her whipped. She did not feel a single ounce of fear or pity for the pathetic, trembling old man who had selfishly thrown his own gentle, innocent son away like rotting garbage in the ruins. She simply leaned back comfortably against Alexander's incredibly solid chest, offering the terrified Duke a small, perfectly cold smile that silently promised him an eternity of agonizing regret. Alexander guided their horse slowly into the silent, completely subdued streets of the wealthy capital, the heavy hooves clicking loudly like a ticking clock counting down to final judgment. Every single wealthy citizen and arrogant noble had already fallen to their knees on the snowy sidewalks, their heads bowed incredibly low in pure, instinctual reverence to their new rulers. The royal throne room eagerly awaits us, my beautiful love, Alexander murmured smoothly, his deep, rumbling voice meant strictly for her delicate ears as they rode toward the magnificent palace. And I fully intend to make my treacherous, cowardly father completely scrub the floors clean with his bare hands before I permanently sever his worthless head from his shoulders. Grace closed her eyes momentarily, breathing deeply in the cold city air that was now completely dominated by the comforting, fiercely protective scent of her beloved, invincible Alpha. The magnificent, previously untouchable city that had once treated them both like less than dirt was now entirely, undeniably theirs to command, reshape, or completely destroy. The tragic, heartbreaking story of the sickly outcast and the forgotten orphan maid was officially over, replaced forever by the terrifying, glorious reign of the winter wolf. And as they slowly ascended the grand, towering marble steps of the royal palace, absolutely nothing in heaven or hell could ever hope to stop their righteous vengeance. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand throne room shattered into 1,000 jagged splinters beneath Alexander's effortlessly powerful kick. He strode into the opulent, gold-leafed hall with Grace tucked safely and lovingly against his solid side, his golden eyes blazing with untamed, ancient fury. Duke Sterling cowered pitifully behind his heavy velvet throne, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger and suffocating aristocratic pride. Beside him knelt the broken, weeping figure of Lord Julian, his shattered arm bound tightly in blood-soaked, filthy bandages that no healer could fix. The remaining cowardly nobles and corrupt royal advisers had already plastered themselves helplessly against the cold marble walls, violently trembling in sheer, undeniable terror. Alexander's heavy winter boots echoed like a terrifying death knell against the highly polished floor as he walked straight toward the elevated royal dais. The overwhelming, crushing pressure of his supreme alpha aura completely paralyzed every single breathing person hiding in the vast, luxurious room. Alexander, my beloved and powerful son, please let us be reasonable about this highly unfortunate misunderstanding, the desperate Duke stammered, his voice cracking pitifully into a sob. I can proudly offer you the highest seat on the council, half of all the family's vast wealth, and absolutely any kingdom you desire to conquer. Alexander did not even bother to grace the pathetic, sniveling old man with a single verbal response. He simply released a highly concentrated wave of dark, crushing pheromones directly at the terrified Duke. The immense, invisible force hit the arrogant patriarch like a massive steel warhammer, instantly forcing him to collapse violently to his hands and knees. The Duke's ornate golden crown slipped clumsily from his graying head, clattering loudly and disgracefully against the cold marble stairs. You possess absolutely nothing of true value to offer me, old man, Alexander finally rumbled, his deep, monstrous voice shaking the very foundations of the ancient palace. The only thing I came here to collect is the absolute destruction of your wretched pride and the miserable, selfish lives you took for granted. Alexander gently guided Grace up the velvet-lined stairs, leading her carefully past the groveling Duke until she stood at the very pinnacle of the royal dais. He bent down and picked up the fallen golden crown from the floor, thoroughly disgusted by the cheap, corrupt metal that had unjustly ruled his tragic life for so long. Instead of placing it triumphantly upon his own head, Alexander simply crushed the heavy gold in his bare hand until it was nothing more than a twisted, useless lump. A true, divine king does not need a stolen, blood-soaked trinket to prove his absolute authority over this miserable world, he declared to the terrified, weeping audience. He turned his full attention back to Grace, his terrifying, lethal demeanor instantly melting into an expression of profound, breathtaking adoration. And my magnificent, perfect queen certainly does not need the tainted gold of cowardly men to validate her divine right to rule by my side. Grace looked down quietly at the pathetic, weeping Duke who had once viciously ordered her to scrub these very floors until her delicate hands bled. She felt the incredibly soothing, powerful hum of her own awakened omega magic coursing through her veins, perfectly matching the fierce, protective heartbeat of her alpha. You once called me a filthy, worthless servant who was completely beneath your aristocratic notice, Your Grace, she said, her voice melodic but beautifully, lethally sharp. "Look very closely at me right now, and tell me exactly who is begging in the dirty shadows for their pathetic, meaningless life." The Duke slowly lifted his tear-stained, wrinkled face, his dull eyes wide with utter disbelief as he stared at the breathtaking, radiant woman glowing with true, undeniable power. Julian suddenly let out a deranged, hysterical scream, his broken, fragile mind completely unable to process the absolute loss of his prestigious noble birthright. He blindly snatched a fallen guard's heavy steel sword from the floor with his good hand and lunged desperately toward the elevated throne in a suicidal fury. "I will absolutely never bow to a crippled freak and a filthy little whore," Julian shrieked, his handsome face twisted into an ugly, monstrous mask of pure jealousy. Alexander did not even turn his body to look at his foolishly charging brother. He simply shifted his immense weight and backhanded the broken lord with terrifying speed. The devastating, casual blow sent Julian flying backward entirely across the massive hall, his fragile body crashing violently against a thick marble pillar with a sickening crunch. Julian slumped heavily to the polished floor, completely motionless, his miserable, cruel life finally extinguished before he could ever cause Grace another ounce of pain. The entire throne room instantly fell into a horrifying, breathless silence, absolutely no one daring to even twitch under the Winter Wolf's lethal, glowing gaze. "You, father, will not receive the quick, painless mercy of a swift death today," Alexander whispered coldly, his golden eyes locking onto the trembling patriarch. "You will be immediately stripped of all your fine silks, your warm, luxurious fires, and your stolen, hoarded wealth. You will be dragged forcefully to the forsaken northern keep and locked securely inside those freezing, rotting walls without a single scrap of food or firewood. You will slowly, agonizingly rot away in the exact same frozen hell where you so callously and eagerly left me to die in the snow." Alexander wrapped his strong, heavily muscled arm securely around Grace's delicate waist, pulling her flush against his solid, fiercely protective chest. "And as you draw your final, freezing breath in the absolute dark, you will know that the Winter Wolf and his beautiful queen are finally bringing true justice to this world. The heavy, oppressive darkness that had unjustly strangled the grand capital for decades was finally and permanently lifted." Alexander had efficiently and ruthlessly dismantled his father's corrupt royal council, replacing their cruel mandates with his absolute, undeniable law. The terrified, pampered nobles had eagerly sworn their undying fealty to the legendary Winter Wolf, begging desperately for the gentle mercy his beautiful queen so graciously offered. But as the golden winter sun slowly dipped below the snowy, pristine horizon, the terrifying god of war gladly left his blood-stained throne behind. He easily swept Grace into his incredibly powerful arms, carrying her effortlessly up the sweeping marble staircases to the highest, most secure tower of the Grand Palace. This magnificent, sprawling bedchamber was once strictly reserved for the arrogant Duke alone, but tonight, it belonged entirely to the new king and his magnificent fated mate. The massive, heavily draped room was comfortably heated by a roaring stone fireplace, filling the quiet, intimate space with the deeply soothing crackle of burning pine. Alexander gently set Grace down upon the plush, exquisite silk-covered mattress, his glowing golden eyes instantly softening into pure adoration as he looked at her. He carefully stripped away his heavy leather armor and the dark, blood-stained tunic that carried the brutal, undeniable evidence of his righteous vengeance. Underneath the flickering, warm firelight, his incredibly broad, heavily muscled chest was a breathtaking canvas of ancient, glowing magical runes and old, fully healed scars. Grace did not look away in fear from the painful, tragic reminders of his dark past. Instead, she reached out bravely with her delicate, warm hands to softly touch him. Her soft, trembling fingertips gently traced a jagged silver line deeply etched across his powerful collarbone, her touch radiating an overwhelming, unconditional love that made his breath catch. "The war is truly and finally over, my fierce Alexander," she murmured beautifully, her soothing omega scent of wild vanilla and jasmine wrapping around him like a heavy, protective blanket. Alexander closed his glowing eyes and leaned heavily, completely surrendering into her gentle touch, allowing the immense, exhausting weight of his lifelong struggle to finally wash away. He dropped gracefully to his knees right beside the massive luxury bed, burying his handsome, exhausted face deep into the warm, incredibly fragrant curve of her delicate neck. For the very first time in his entire brutal, unforgiving life, the legendary winter wolf felt completely and absolutely safe enough to let his terrifying guard completely down. I conquered this entire wretched, broken kingdom just to ensure that absolutely no one could ever hurt you again, my sweet Grace, he whispered fiercely, his breath hot against her soft skin. But I swear to you, I would gladly trade every single piece of stolen gold and every polished marble tower just to hold you in my arms like this for a single night. Grace smiled so softly, lovingly threading her slender fingers through his thick, dark hair as she pulled his massive frame even closer to her rapidly, joyfully beating heart. She realized with absolute clarity in that deeply intimate moment that the terrifying monster the whole world feared was actually the most devoted, gentle soul she had ever known. He had viciously and effortlessly torn down an entire corrupt empire with his bare hands, yet he was now kneeling before her exactly like a humble, devout worshipper at a sacred altar. You absolutely never have to fight all alone in the freezing dark anymore, my beloved, magnificent Alpha, she promised, her melodic voice resonating with the absolute certainty of their eternal bond. I am right here with you, and I will stand faithfully by your side until the very stars fall from the dark winter sky. Alexander slowly lifted his head, his brilliant golden eyes shining with a profound, breathless devotion that was strictly reserved exclusively for her beautiful, mesmerizing emerald gaze. He climbed slowly and deliberately onto the luxurious, massive bed, his immense, muscular body completely blanketing hers in a heavy, comforting cocoon of absolute security and blistering, wonderful heat. When his soft lips finally captured hers, it was not the frantic, desperate kiss of two traumatized survivors fleeing a frozen, unforgiving wasteland. It was a deeply passionate, agonizingly slow claim of total, eternal devotion, sealing their fated, intertwined souls perfectly together with a fiery, unbreakable promise. The tragic, entirely forgotten orphan maid had successfully tamed the most dangerous, lethal predator in the entire realm with absolutely nothing but her pure, unwavering kindness. And the broken, heavily scarred outcast had finally found the one magnificent, breathtaking treasure that made his painful, lonely existence entirely and profoundly worthwhile. Outside the thick, frost-covered glass windows, the silent, snowy city rested peacefully under the watchful, benevolent, and highly protective gaze of their new, incredibly powerful rulers. The terrible old era of cruel, selfish oppression and aristocratic arrogance had been permanently and rightfully buried beneath the heavy, cleansing winter snow. Tomorrow, they would begin the massive, deeply challenging work of rebuilding a fair, perfectly just society entirely from the shattered ashes of the corrupt past. But tonight, the treacherous world outside the heavy mahogany doors simply ceased to exist for the deeply entwined, madly in love soulmates. There was absolutely nothing else but the roaring warmth of the golden fire, the intoxicating, perfect blend of their matched pheromones, and the undeniable truth of their beautiful destiny. Grace wrapped her delicate arms incredibly tightly around his broad, unyielding shoulders, finally pulling him down into the beautiful, endless eternity they had both fought so hard to earn. The brutal, unforgiving winter finally surrendered to the vibrant, fragrant embrace of a glorious, blooming spring. The once frozen streets of the capital were now completely overflowing with golden sunlight and the joyful, triumphant cheers of a liberated people. Today marked the historic coronation of Alexander and Grace, a day that the ancient history books would forever remember as the dawn of the Golden Age. Alexander stood upon the grand palace balcony, his massive frame draped in royal velvet that carried the proud, silver emblem of the winter wolf. He looked down at the massive, adoring crowd with his glowing golden eyes, but his true focus remained entirely on the breathtaking woman standing by his side. Grace wore a magnificent gown of shimmering white silk and emerald lace, her beauty so radiant it seemed to outshine the very sun above them. She was no longer the frightened, invisible maid who scrubbed blood from the cold stone floors in the dark. She was the sovereign queen of the north, the legendary Omega whose heart had successfully tamed the most dangerous predator in existence. With a slow, incredibly reverent movement, Alexander took the heavy, diamond-encrusted crown and placed it gently upon Grace's chestnut hair. "I do not give you this crown to make you my queen," he declared, his deep, rumbling voice carrying to every single corner of the silent, waiting city. "I give it to the world to remind them that you have always been the true, divine ruler of my soul and this entire kingdom." The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of absolute, unbridled joy, their voices rising like a powerful tide to wash away the last remaining shadows of the past. In that exact, triumphant moment, a dusty, exhausted messenger arrived with the final, grim report from the desolate northern keep. The former Duke of Stirling had finally drawn his last, agonizing breath in the freezing dark, exactly as Alexander had so rightfully promised. The cycle of cruelty was officially and permanently broken, leaving nothing behind but the bright, hopeful promise of a fair and just future. Alexander led Grace back into the quiet, flower-scented sanctuary of the royal gardens as the massive celebration continued loudly into the warm evening. He gently pulled her into his powerful, protective embrace, resting his large, warm hand softly against the subtle, beautiful curve of her stomach. A new life was stirring within her, a perfect blend of their unbreakable bond and the legendary, ancient bloodline of the winter wolf. "Our child will never know the cold, the hunger, or the fear that we both once suffered, my beautiful Grace," Alexander whispered against her hair. "They will grow up in a world where loyalty is rewarded and love is the only law that truly matters," she replied, leaning her head against his solid chest. The sunset painted the sky in magnificent shades of violet and gold, casting a long, peaceful shadow over the prosperous, peaceful kingdom they had built. The tragic story of the abandoned outcast and the selfless orphan maid had reached its final, most perfect chapter. They were no longer defined by the scars of their past, but by the infinite, radiant light of their shared, magnificent destiny. As the first stars of the evening began to twinkle above the palace spires, the king and queen walked slowly into their bright, endless forever. The legend of the winter wolf was finally complete, and the world was finally, beautifully at peace.